All right, week 1, Das Kapital by Karl Marx. Honestly, I know nothing about Karl Marx as it is, especially recently though. Of course, I've heard Marxism brought up all the time, and I have such a vague idea of what that is. I almost see him as another Hitler, which I know is incredibly ridiculous to think that. So before I even start reading this, I want to get a little bit of history of who he is, how he not only changed Germany, but the entire world, and of course, how he defined labor. Here's an interesting thing from EconLib. Karl Marx was communism's most zealous intellectual advocate. That's a really interesting description, I feel like, because you always hear about these crazy ideas, and the way that they're legitimized for the entire world is, oh, there's an intellectual person who's interested. That idea can really be seen through so many different philosophies or even religions. People are questioning it until there's one person that has notoriety at all, and they go, oh, they have a PhD, I'm gonna trust them. I found a documentary on who he is. I'm gonna watch that, and then I'm gonna start reading this book. Hey Google, turn off the desk.
He spent 12 hours a day gathering evidence for his definitive critique of capitalism. Das Kapital. By the 1860s, Britain was the idea that I find most compelling is his idea about the alienation of labor. If you're cut off from the fruits of your labor, if you're cut off from your creativity, then you lose your sense of self.
That was fascinating. And like we talked about in class, I could definitely tell there was a specific narrative. They were definitely painting Marx as more of a hero than a villain, going really in depth in how there was a major distorted appropriation of his ideas into these other places, specifically Nazi Germany, going as far as to say that his whole platform was how much he hated ideologies, and yet his ideas were taken out of context to become one of the largest and most strict ideologies to ever exist. So I already have a little bit of a sense now of how it talks about labor. They even mentioned labor several times. So now it's time to read this book and see what he wanted to show the world that so many people did not connect with. Okay, it just took me from 9:30 p.m. to midnight to read section 1. I had to read each paragraph like 8 times to actually retain what was being said. There's some very interesting content in there, but to be honest, so far, Marx is kind of reminding me of like a business Instagram influencer. He's using very clever dialogue and interesting ways to just say something very basic. It almost seems like the presentation is more important than the content itself. I don't know. Before I started reading the actual section, I took a look at some of the prefaces talking about the translations. One of them was written by Federick Engels, who was basically his right-hand man, business partner. He said that sometimes this book was referred to as the Bible of the working class. So far I'm getting the impression that this is really trying to talk to the common person, someone who's just trying to make their way in this crazy unstable time that he's writing it. Instead of saying that capitalism has done nothing good, he acknowledges that, but he kind of just puts it in the light of being unsustainable, not bad. Engels even said that he expressed that free trade was exhausting its resources. He even mentions that he wanted a peaceful and legal revolution. And now I'm starting to know why this was brought up in modern politics.
The political revolution must continue.
So now I want to talk about what that resource he's talking about really is. And of course, it's the value put in something through labor. So after talking about the differences between use value and exchange value, he kind of went into why exchange value has to be expressed in very common terms between whatever commodities are being talked about. And he honestly used a very eloquent way to describe this, showing that to measure rectilinear shapes, you use triangles. But inherently, the area of those triangles themselves are entirely separate. It's just to create a common measuring technique. And in the same way, if the commodities are entirely different, which they kind of have to be in this situation, there still has to be something found that is common to both of them. When that's found to be the labor put into it, it's also interesting how he has to define how that's going to be equal. So it's not like just because a lot of time was put into something, it makes it inherently better. In fact, at the very end, he even shows that something that's useless is still going to have no value, even if a lot of labor was put into it, which is a really profound idea of labor and shows that it's not as simple and as quantitative as people often like to think it is. It's also interesting how he mentions that technology advancements change the value of labor, which is still something that I feel like is talked about all the time today. It seems a little unfair, but it's true. As technology gets better, the amount of time put into using something that's not as advanced is gonna lose value. It reminded me of when Andrew Yang was running for a presidential candidate in 2020. His whole platform was how he was gonna navigate the loss of jobs through automation. And it's just very interesting that the same idea of labor having to be shifted just because something is changing in the environment or how we're creating, that change in efficiency for whatever kind of job that is, was still talked about in the 1800s in the same way that it was in the 21st century. Now that I finished section 1 and got the basics out of the way, I can't wait to see how he expands on this in the following sections. And at the end, I want to round it all together. Labor is its father, and earth its mother. This is a William Petty quote that Marx included in section 2, and I think it really defined a lot of what he was talking about in this entire chapter. After he defined commodities as a human want in the first section, in the second section he goes a little bit more in depth and talks about how that commodity is built up from matter itself, and then the labor it takes to alter that matter to become something useful. It was basically the same as the law that came out 100 years earlier, the law of conservation of mass. Matter cannot be created nor destroyed. He talks about how production is basically appropriating nature-made materials into something that has a use value for us. I think this once again drives home the importance of labor that he's describing. Another thing I found interesting was how he separated skilled versus simple labor and talked about how most of the time skilled labor ends up being boiled down into simple labor and the quantities can kind of be mixed. It reminded me of that quote that goes, you know, you're not being paid for that 2 hours of work you did, you're being paid for the 10,000 hours of work that you did to learn how to do that task in 2 hours. The biggest thing I got out of these sections, though, is how much he drove home the point that exchange values aren't physical, that the value of something only exists within the narrative of a society or within somebody's personal viewpoints. And that's why this whole book exists, right? It's so hard to define what value is on an object or of a person's work. When he describes commodities as both objects of utility and also depositories of value, he accentuates that that value only exists in a social reality, not in a physical one. And this, of course, is where money comes in. The universal equivalent that can be used to describe and express value of everything. And he does bring up the importance of having conversion rates between different forms of money, which of course are constantly changing, so that has to be accounted for. Probably, in my opinion, the biggest downfalls of money. Change of value as you go across the world. But of course, that's impossible to fix, right? Well, I feel like that's where he's trying to kind of rebuild the system, or at least expose the current system. Probably my favorite quote from Marx thus far is that money itself has no price. This could be taken really literally, like in the value of what actual gold does for people or paper money, or I was kind of taking it in a more figurative sense, where just the idea of exchange itself can't have value. Only values being traded back and forth. We finished off by looking at the metamorphosis of commodities into money and then back. The CMC explanation was really interesting. I think it could also be seen as an LCMC. Labor starts it. He even mentions that labor goes in to create the commodity, then the commodity can be turned into money, and then, you know, whatever. And to cap it off, I found the sentence, "No one can sell unless someone else purchases," to be really interesting. And that kind of shows his main point, that capitalism becomes a machine that can't stop and it needs to constantly be growing. So those were my main thoughts of this chapter so far. Honestly, again, I'm gonna bring this up. It seems like it has an excessive number of buzzwords and sound bites almost. Like, Marx would probably be really good on a podcast, because you could take all these snippets out of these interesting things he's saying, yet you'll read for 40 pages and very few points are actually included. I may be looking at it wrong, but I almost see it coming from a sense of fear. The documentary I watched showed that he didn't just want to change capitalism because he wanted to be in control. In fact, he didn't want that at all. He wanted a change that could keep the economy actually sustainable, and he didn't see capitalism as a solution for that. He saw a system that was failing, so he wanted to change it. Rather than a revolution, it almost could have been described as an evolution. And that ends week 1.